Wide Open, The Naked Truth, Confronting Implicit Bias, and Breaking Kinship Care Myths. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You should see a control panel on the right side of your computer desktop. In the control panel, you will find an audio and a question section. You can listen to the session either by using your computer speakers or by phone. If you decided to listen by phone, please be sure the telephone option is selected in the audio section of your control panel, and that you enter all the telephone information displayed, including the audio pin. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions section of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the live question and answer session to be conducted at the end of today's presentation. On behalf of A Second Chance Incorporated, we thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this conversation, which we hope will be informative and offer you a new and refreshed perspective on kinship care. We'd like to begin by introducing ourselves. I am Lisa Chambers, the Systems Engagement Director.
I'm J.K. Dash, VP of Communications and Content.
And I'm Bray Slow, Senior Executive Vice President of Child and Family Services.
So let's begin. Sylvia is standing in the welfare line. Who did you see in your mind? Miss Divine is marching in the Gay Rights Parade. Who are you envisioning in your mind? That's the person in charge of technology here. Who came to your mind? Those children are in foster care. Who did you see in your mind?
In the child welfare system, cases involving children of color are more likely to be screened in, investigated, substantiated, and recommended for out-of-home placement. Why is that? The why can be found in the creation of myths. A myth is a story that's handed down through history. Usually it's told through oral tradition that explains or gives value to something that we don't know about. And myths can become a widely held but false belief or idea. So what myths about kin and family have been created in child welfare? Is our perspective on family correct? Is implicit bias responsible for creating these kinship myths? Having the myth have been around for a long time, we have created a tale of two systems. Is there a myth that the road to foster care is better and safer than the road to kinship care?
Before we begin, we would like to provide you with an overview of our presentation. In the first part of the presentation, we'll do a quick review of change and transformation in kinship care. Next, we will explore what a frame of reference looks like in kinship care. We will look at the forming of paradigms in kinship care. The section that follows examines how bias is developed as a result of our personal frames of reference and paradigms. And finally, we demonstrate how perspective bias plays out in kinship care. In our last webinar, we told you that kinship care is truly transformative. It's worth repeating because it ties directly into a theme of transforming biases in kinship care. Consider this word, transformative. We could have said kinship care changed child welfare, which is also impactful, but in a much different way. Let's look more closely at the words change and transformative. It's natural for people to use change and transformation interchangeably. Change, though, is very action-oriented. Think about changing a tire. It's something that you are physically doing. It's outward. Change is typically executed. The other thing about change is duration. Typically, when things change, they can change back again. You could, for instance, get another flat tire. Now let's look at something that transforms. When something transforms, something new happens. It's more of a reinvention. Transformation tends to be more internal. When things transform, we have a future vision of something. We know the caterpillar will transfer into a butterfly in the future. If we take this future vision into the human experience, transformation is connected to what we feel, what we believe, and what we value. So when we say kinship care is transformative, we must consider feelings, belief systems, and value propositions. Biases can affect these feelings, these belief systems, and value propositions. Let's reacquaint ourselves and consider how a second chance took a value for family and transformed kinship care in a practice where family and the system was able to transform. This is a photo of one of our first offices here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we began to answer the call on kinship care in 1994. Let's fast forward another 20 years, and this is a picture of our present corporate office here in Pittsburgh. For 22 years, we have answered the call of kinship care, and I'm proud to say that our model of kinship care has been the strategy, not a strategy, for our partnership with Allegheny County Department of Human Services in Pittsburgh. Let's take a quick look at the kinship landscape where we are working. Here is the data in the state of Pennsylvania. 43% of children and youth are placed with strangers, non-relatives. 29% are placed with kin. And 20% are in group homes and congregate care. In Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is located, there's a goal to have 70% of all children in placement with licensed kinship caregivers. We are presently at 50%, and this is due to the excellent public-private partnership a second chance in the Department of Human Services has had over the last 22 years. In Philadelphia County, there is a goal to have 55% of all children with licensed kinship caregivers. Philadelphia currently has 47% of children and youth with kin. As a point of reference, Pennsylvania is a county administered system, and the two largest counties are doing well and above the state level in placing children with kin. On a daily basis, a Second Chance Incorporated serves over 1,600 of these children between both cities. It is important to remember that we are a founder brand of kinship care. This is Dr. McDaniel, the founder, CEO, and president of A Second Chance. Her personal story is also the story of A Second Chance. Because of this story, we look at everything through our branded kinship lens. This deliberate branding leads to a keen kinship care insight. Before we could get into the bias and myths involved with kinship care, we have to look at how people acquire and build knowledge in kinship care. So let's look at how myths are created. Consider this kitchen. Would you say it's big, or would you say it's It depends on your frame of reference. If you live in a small home or an apartment in a city, you may find that this kitchen is big. However, if you live in a large home in the suburbs or country, you may find that this kitchen looks kind of small. You are using your knowledge base and experience to determine the size of this kitchen. Think of a frame of reference as providing us with a filter that helps us create meaning. This filter includes beliefs, preferences, values, and culture. But it is not easy to separate everything through the filter, so we tend to clump things together. This clumping forms assumptions as well as attitudes. Let's take a closer look at frame of reference. Let's look at this frame of reference in kinship care from a more logistical perspective. A frame of reference can be considered a coordinate system. Consider this red dot. It's isolated. We know nothing about it. There is no context. By providing some context, in this case a plot with coordinates, we can begin to build knowledge and meaning. We now at least have a point of origin, and we can place some things in context. How does this coordinated base frame of reference look in traditional foster care versus kinship care? Why it is important to consider informing bias. In traditional foster care with strangers, there is a frame of reference that is very uniform in regards to the caregiver as well as the out-of-home placement process in general. Points of origin are extremely close. There is very little variation in approach, training, and support because we have a historical frame of reference on how foster care works with foster families. In kinship care, that frame of reference is very different. Points of origin are vastly different and depend on the individual family. General uniformity makes no sense in the approach, in training, and support. Framing is an important consideration in changing how we work alongside kinship families, because many times we are considering our own reality through our own frame of references subconsciously. Our cultural frame of reference in particular is important to consider in kinship care. Our cultural background influences our frame of reference. Culture is unique in regards to our beliefs, our attitudes, values, and past experiences. It's our unique and personal way of looking and how we perceive the world. It is our cultural frame of reference which forms the basis for how we interpret what we see and messages that we receive that involves cultures other than our own. Why does a second chance consider this approach so important? Because child welfare cannot dismiss the cultural significance of family by simply applying an institutionalized and standardized lens. Let's look at how this personal frame of reference impacts a family in crisis. Let's start with you. Your cultural frame of reference has a foundation. It is built upon what you were taught, what you learn, what you experience, and what you value and believe. We are personally framing our world. So now let's enter the kinship family. Are we using our own personal cultural frame of reference to prescribe for the family and to help them through crisis? Is our foundation imposed on them even in an unconscious way. We must first remember that the family has its own unique cultural frame of reference. Their foundation is not the same as our foundation. Because the family has their own cultural frame of reference, we must work with them in how they frame the situation. Thus, it becomes what the family was taught, what the members of the family have learned, what the family has experienced, and what the family has come to value and believe. Our cultural frames of reference provides us a unique perspective. We like to think our view is an objective view of the world around us. We may even concede that everyone's perspective is unique. But the truth at the end of the day is we still have come to some confidence and belief that there is objectivity in our perception, our frame of reference. But we know this cannot be true.
Now let's look at how something so innocent as a frame of reference can become a paradigm that turns into a bias. Our frame of reference gives us something. First, our frame of reference gives us a perspective, which is our perspective. From that perspective, we form paradigms. A paradigm is defined as a typical example or a pattern of something. It's a model. Paradigms are not innately bad. Paradigms are very, very useful for us in daily life. Paradigms result from frames of reference that we then use to organize our observations, then how we reason, and eventually how we process things. Simply said, paradigms help us do things more easily. They help us to anticipate, organize, and filter all the information we receive all day long. Because of paradigms, we can do things like tie our shoes easily without thinking about it, use our cell phones, drive a car. Here's another simple example of a paradigm. Every morning the sun comes up and I know it's daytime, so I get out of bed and I start my day. But paradigms can also be dangerous when we want to challenge their validity. Particular paradigms can limit our ability to recognize new things. We forget that many problems or challenges have more than one right answer. They have more than one paradigm. People who don't understand the role of paradigms, or that paradigms can change, are often blinded to other options. Do you have someone in your family who still doesn't use a cell phone? Let's take our example of the sun. If you're standing north of the Arctic Circle around the time of the summer solstice, the sun is visible for a complete full 24 hours. It's not just out during the day. This means our paradigm is now incorrect. So now let's apply this to kinship care. Are we using foster care paradigms in kinship care? Are we using culturally inappropriate paradigms in kinship care? So what does this all look like in kinship care? Well, what we believe to be true about families may not be true about families. For instance, when you think of a home and family, this is a very common paradigm that most people see. But what happens if you're a child welfare worker? What happens when this paradigm is challenged? How do our personal paradigms play out in kinship care when the family and the home is living here instead? Despite our well-meaning and our well-intentions, we respond to the structural and institutionalized paradigms of family. We think automatically of that white picket fence. Sometimes we need to alter or shift a paradigm. We have to replace an old paradigm with a new paradigm. But to do this, we need an agent of change. We need a catalyst that's going to instigate the change. For instance, remember back to the invention of the printing press. The printing press changed the way we communicate, changed how we get knowledge. It changed how we receive information. Likewise, jump ahead. The internet has changed the entire paradigm of how we can communicate now. We get knowledge in a different way. We receive information in a different way. We believe that kinship care is the catalyst that is needed to change child welfare. So why do we need a paradigm shift in kinship care at all? This is why. Because children across the country are sleeping on office furniture in child welfare offices when there are kin available for them. Why are we ignoring kin? We cannot ignore that we alter things according to our frame of reference. We must be trained to recognize a different perspective of kinship care to get to a different outcome. What does the story tell us about service delivery in kinship care? Well, first we acknowledge that we have staff, and that staff is coming in with their own acquired belief systems. We know that the belief systems have various frames of references. And they use these different frames when they are working with families. These frames of reference mean that our agency has several operating paradigms that are all going on at the same time. These paradigms then influence beliefs and behaviors when we're working with kinship families. In other words, the paradigms are influencing the process, and thus the process is service delivery. That's why it's important to deliberately address implicit bias and frame of reference and perspective in kinship care training. We have to have purposeful training on paradigms in kinship care. In our model, this means our process, our service delivery, is all triad-based. It addresses the perspective of all parts of the triad: the child and youth, the caregiver, and the birth family. We have specific services that are framed from the perspective of that part of the triad. For instance, if you look at the chart, grandparents need different support than younger single parents when it comes to kinship care. One size does not fit all. In our next section, we're going to look at how bias is developed from our personal frames of reference and the resulting paradigms. We're going to start off by giving a definition of implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or the stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner, things that we're not consciously thinking about. To kind of get you thinking about what implicit bias is all about, it's all about associations. So we're going to do a short exercise about associations. When I say start, I want you to yourself or out loud read the words from left to right horizontally, starting at the top, and then moving down as you complete a row. So for instance, I would say red, green, blue, and then move on to the next row, orange, blue, green. I'm going to give you about 10 or 15 seconds to do this. Start now and count to yourself how many words you're getting. Okay, how quickly were you able to do that? Did it take you a while? Was it very fast? Now we're going to do the same thing, but I'm going to change the chart. We're going to do the same exact thing. When I say start, read the words from left to right horizontally. Start at the top row, then move down to the next row. Let's see how many words you get this time. Okay, here we go. And stop. So what did you notice? Did you notice anything different? Which time was it easier? You should have noticed that it's easier and quicker to read the word red when it's written in red, rather than read the word red when it's written in green. It's about making associations. Our brain automatically can align two concepts together. The bottom line is we associate traits with categories. This can lead to implicit bias. So what does that look like in kinship care? Think back to the color association test we just did. Can we do the same thing here? Can we associate two things together? The roots of this tree run very deep. It's a very old apple tree here. We can say that implicit bias is at the root of myths in kinship care. It are those roots that form these myths. There is an implicit bias in kinship care that We need to keep children in out-of-home placements away from kin. And the myth is that one bad apple will spoil the whole bunch. So we typically see that child welfare workers are inclined to favor what they think as higher status families. This is an implicit bias that associates kin with something bad. It starts to form the myth. Child welfare deals with implicit bias on a lot of multiple systems, and this further complicates things for kinship families. We can blame lack of sufficient social work staff. We can say that it's limited resources, that the caseloads are heavy. But at the bottom of it, a lot of the problems go back to the myths of kinship care. If we look at all the cases going on, we have implicit bias with caseworkers. There is implicit bias in the judicial system. There is implicit bias with caseworker interactions. There's even implicit bias in the outcomes that we have for safety, permanency, and well-being. Are they really being written for kinship families, or are they being really written for foster care families? Also, we have to go back to higher education. What are we teaching child welfare workers in school about kinship and families? This is an intertwined and a knotted system, and we're showing that all the possible points at which myths can be formed. Now we're going to take a look at the big R and the little r of racism. The implicit bias associations we hold arise outside of our conscience. We're not thinking about them. They necessarily don't align with what we tell people outwardly. It indicates how child welfare workers unconsciously rely on racial and cultural biases to drive and determine case outcomes. So when we're speaking to this big R and little r of racism, Professor Cynthia Lee said, the social science research demonstrates that one does not have to be a racist with a capital R or one who intentionally discriminates on the basis of race to harbor implicit racial bias. So are we imposing our paradigm of family on kinship care families? Are we imposing what our paradigm of a family should be? Remember, what you believe to be true may not be true. That idea of the perfect family is a paradigm that will create myths in child welfare and kinship care. Let's take a look at some of these myths and association about kinship care. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Oh, they're in it for the money. Kinship caregivers are all old and poor. Kinship homes are not safe. Kinship homes are not stable places for children. Oh, you can never locate kin easily. Permanency in kinship care is extremely difficult. What is causing this perpetual cycle of family not being valued? What is creating this spiral of myth? Implicit biases. It creates attitudes and perspective that perpetuates the myth. But everything is not lost when it comes to overcoming implicit bias in child welfare. We know that implicit biases are malleable. They can be unlearned. We can replace old ideas with new ideas, old perspectives with new perspectives, negative associations with positive ones. Implicit bias comes from the culture. If I think of them as the thumbprint of the culture on our mind, it all makes sense, because human beings have the ability to learn to associate two things quickly, just like we did with the color red and the word red. We can teach ourselves what we choose to associate. It's up to us.
How do we teach ourselves about racism and implicit bias in kinship care? We know we are informed by our own experiences, and thus we must carefully consider how we guide the triad through the decision-making process. Notice how we say that the triad is making the decisions. We are not making decisions for the triad. To be successful with trusting in the value of family and letting the triad guide the process, we look to reflective decision-making and kinship care, In kinship care, we are assisting, not making decisions for the triad. Acknowledge that implicit bias impacts decision-making. Self-reflection can be used to counter implicit bias in decision-making. Thus, decision-making in kinship care requires a way of looking at child welfare that is in sync with what we believe about the value of family. Research in our theory to practice model tells us that reflective decision-making is an important tool in combating implicit bias in kinship care. In the child welfare system, reflective decision-making training and implicit and instructional bias training interventions was associated with less home removal and fewer non-relative foster care placements. Now let's put reflective decision-making into the context of kinship care training and education. To debias in kinship care, you need to be strategic. It has taken a lifetime to build and strengthen negative associations, so it will also take some time to undo them and replace them with positive associations. In kinship care, we need active and ongoing processes that address implicit bias in child welfare practices. A one-time activity or a brief training, there's 3 central strategic areas that need attention in order to debias kinship care. They are education, which develops understanding and creates awareness about the concept of implicit bias. Training, where we put understanding into action. And exposure, where we work alongside a variety of cultures in kinship care. Let's take a closer look at how you plan to debias relationships with the triad. Education, training, and exposure must all be connected to each other. One is not in isolation of the other. Next, we must consider themes and decision-making pertinent to kinship care. Central themes are around safety, well-being, and permanency. In child welfare, reflective decision-making typically occurs within these themes. Reflective decision-making is an important part of this process. It involves first looking inward at one's own self, then outward at the external environment, and then back at oneself. With reflective decision-making, we know we are informed by our own experiences, and thus we must carefully consider how we guide the triad through their decision-making process in kinship care. We begin by looking at counter-stereotypic education, training, and exposure. This means we provide data and research that dismantles stereotypes. It also means we expose staff to individuals who do not fit the stereotype. In kinship care, we can do this with panels of caregivers, birth families, and children. Next, we consider intergroup connections, where they are byproducts, is synergy that counters implicit bias. Small and large group of people generally reduce intergroup prejudice. We must surround staff with others who are committed to greater impartiality. This helps positively influence individual implicit beliefs and behaviors. We have to build accountability into the process. When staff knows they will be held accountable for the work with families or different cultures, we know there is a decrease in behaviors that are reflective of implicit bias. Staff should be able to clearly articulate the process and reasoning. We initially discussed perspective when we addressed frame of reference at the start of the webinar. The idea of walking in someone else's shoes on the surface appears easy, but in kinship care, that is complex because the triad presents multiple perspectives to consider. Deliberate processing is needed to ensure implicit bias is considered in all areas. Staff must practice making counter-stereotypic associations. How do we see implicit bias strategically addressed in kinship care? Child welfare professionals say they are strategically addressing implicit bias in their kinship care process because it's called out once in policy and practice. But what it looks like in training and education speaks to the importance placed upon it. At a Second Chance Incorporated, we have developed a kinship-specific training curriculum called Standards for Training and Advancing Kinship Care. Here's what we've noticed over the 22 years we have been developing kinship-specific curriculum. For many child welfare agencies, it is one-and-done topic, typically addressed in a new hire training. Someone cannot be biased during a one-time activity. Remember, it has taken a lifetime to build and strengthen negative associations. You must facilitate the time to remove them and build positive ones. Other agencies introduce implicit bias at the time of the new hire and then loop back to it once a year. Still, others loop back to it continually. Even though the frequency is evident, the depth of the topics remain redundant. In a case like this, the agency only addresses one cultural bias, such as race, and overlooks all others. Cultures such as gender and sexual orientation, for example, may never be considered. In best practice type approach, implicit bias is spiraled through education, training, and exposure opportunities at the agency. Here, implicit bias is addressed from onboarding to the exit interview. The subjects are broad and explored in depth. The interactions of many cultures at the same time are addressed for implicit bias. For instance, what bias do we have towards African American women who is single parent living in a rural area? Here we can find implicit bias based upon race, gender, marital status, and geographical residence. To better understand how implicit bias plays out in kinship care, we need to consider how it interacts with perspective. Take a look at the sketch. Where is the family sitting? Westerners are accustomed to the corners and box-like shapes of architecture. They are more likely to place the family indoors and to interpret the rectangle above the woman's head as a window through which shrubbery can be seen. When scientists showed a similar sketch to people from East Africa, a culture containing few angular visual cues, the family is seen sitting under a tree. The woman is balancing an item on her head. And since we come from different places in life, we see things differently. Perspective becomes very important here. Perspective is influenced by culture. We can see how this ideal of multiple perspectives perpetuates racism. From our personal perspective, it is often difficult to understand the actions of others because our inclination is to evaluate those against what we would do. Let's look at the heroin versus crack epidemic. With the crack epidemic, we punished. With the heroin epidemic, we are treating. We criminalize one and we treat the other. In child welfare, many people reject the idea that race and ethnic disparities are caused by racism or bias, yet the perspective of traditional families to kinship families is drastic. Foster families see this: shelves full of supplies and assistance. They are offered appropriate and a variety of supports, legal guidance, and attention to needs, straightforward licensing, and relevant training. They are welcome and accepted into the system. Kinship families see this. Please notice the difference. Inappropriate and lack of supports, little to no legal guidance, and needs are ignored. Irrelevant training, difficult and confrontational licensing, inexperienced and non-diverse staff for families of color who are not welcomed into the system. They're viewed as part of the problem. When we make judgments about the behavior of others, we are prone to make mistakes. Why? Because we fill in the missing information from our perspective. Let's take a look at the intimate relationship between the caseworker and the kinship triad. Each part in the relationship is operating from their own perspective. In this case, the experience of family is an important part of the perspective. The idea is to tie the triad's experience of family to kinship care. But of course, the caseworker cannot in reality relate to everything the triad is experiencing. There are gaps in what the caseworker understands about the triad's perspective of the situation. It's natural for the caseworker to fill in the gaps with, well, this is what my family would do. The gaps are not being filled correctly. The caseworker filling in the gaps is the wrong perspective for the triad. The caseworker requires insight, skills, and technique on how to better work from the triad's perspective. When we recreate a situation mentally, we don't have all the information the triad has, and thus our perspective of the same situation is still in our shoes instead of those of the triad. We can say we are walking in someone else's shoes, but perspective coupled with implicit bias actually keeps us firmly in our own. If you are not African American, if you are not gay, if you are not Latino, if you are not living in poverty, can you really understand a perspective? Look at all these faces, each with their own perspective and experience of family. How does our system reflect all of these perspectives and experiences? If you consider implicit bias and perspective, you can see that they can easily be reflected into institutionalized policy and practice. Even in regards to outcomes, does personal perspective lead to outcomes that further reinforce implicit bias? How do we set outcomes? How do we collect data? This matters because how you see me will determine how you treat me, and how you treat me determines the outcomes. At A Second Chance Incorporated, we don't underestimate the influence of understanding and appreciating the importance of culture to kinship care. Differences are a part of the work of kinship care. Understanding cultural differences doesn't make the differences go away. However, the person who understands how differences cause communication breakdowns can take the initiative to try to make the communication work. We're often asked if there are specific tools we use to overcome the communication challenges and at the same time embrace cultural differences. One tool that we have is the Kinship Strength Assessment. This culturally attuned tool is administered under the premise that every family deserves to be assessed on their strengths as opposed to continuously being viewed on their weaknesses, and more often than not, being regarded as negative or at risk. At A Second Chance Incorporated, we say we meet the families where they are. This is a good thing. We are also in a compliance-based system. Compliance-based systems quantify what's good looks like. For instance, what perspective are we measuring compliance from in kinship care? Data must have a guiding idea. In regards to compliance, our guiding idea is that we license in, not out. Historically, we average over 92% in licensing a kinship home in 60 days or less. This data defies the myth of kinship homes being difficult to license because our data starts at the heart. We have a guiding idea that considers perspective and the influence of implicit biases. In other words, we debunk the myths for a guiding idea that is supported by data and research. So if you say the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, we say extended family networks have served as a protective factor in mediating child abuse and neglect among Black families. If you say they're in it for the money, we say many kinship caregivers survive on TANF payments and receive less financial support than non-related foster care providers. If you say kinship caregivers are old and poor, we say kinship caregivers do tend to be older and poorer than non-kin. However, a vast majority of children feel loved by their kin caregivers and happy with their living arrangement. If you say kinship homes are not safe, we say children in kinship care are 3 to 4 times less likely to be maltreated than children in traditional foster homes. If you say kinship homes are not stable, we say children placed with non-relatives are 3 times more likely to be moved to different homes than children in kinship care. If you say you can't locate kin easily, we say experts estimate that children have between 100 to 300 relatives at one time. If you say permanency in kinship care is difficult, we say children in kinship homes are less likely to enter care after they've gone home or been adopted. So, how you see me will determine how you treat me. The consideration of perspective and implicit bias matters in kinship care. The racism of implicit bias is often unintended, but can do just as much harm as intended acts. What do you know about the families in these photos? Any polarization between traditional foster care and kinship care can be typically linked back to the value we place on family. If you want to eliminate the polarization, we need to accept and embrace the diversity of families in kinship care. A colorblind ideology generates greater amounts of implicit bias than a multicultural perspective. We embrace this multicultural perspective in kinship care. We are not blind to the differences between people and families. So then if they say kinship care does not work, they believe in the myth of kinship care, we say the children are thriving in kinship care.
We'd like to thank you for your participation today. Our contact information is below, and you will also receive it in a follow-up email. At this time, we'd like to open this up to a Q&A session if you have any questions. You can submit your questions, some of you have been already, by entering them in the questions section at the bottom of your control panel, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen.
One of the questions that just came through a little earlier is, what is the cultural makeup of your staff? How is this reflective of your client base?
Well, we pride ourselves on ensuring that we actually have a staff that is reflective of the communities that we serve. So as an example, in Pittsburgh, about 50% or over of our clients are African American, so our casework staff reflects that. In the Philadelphia office, we work with a larger Latino population, so we actually have a larger Latino population and caseworkers who are bilingual. So I think we're not static, we change. We look at our data, we look at our numbers, and we look who's in our casework pool, who do we have that can come in, who are we interviewing, who do we have on, who do we have ready to come in. So we're constantly keeping that door open to casework staff.
We have another interesting question that just came through that we seem to get all of the time. Because in our roles as being a private provider, how are we able to differentiate our roles as a private provider from the DHS case manager?
All right, so well, we've been with DHS in Pittsburgh for 22 years. We have a very strong relationship between like a public and private partnership. The one thing we've noticed over the years is that working with the kinship families, they don't see us as the removal agency, so we automatically have a different relationship with the kinship family because we're very much about relationship building. So right away, we're seen as the more supportive role to the family since we didn't remove the children in the first place. But also working with DHS, it's a partnership, so we're all working together on a comprehensive family plan. So we're looking also at things like transportation in conjunction with DHS, medical and mental health. We actually put a mental health clinic on our facility in Pittsburgh, so it's easier for clients to get there. Even with screening, we work in conjunction with DHS to make sure that we're having enough potential kin on the book so that if one kin placement doesn't work out, we can automatically go to another. So we do that in conjunction with DHS. Looking at how we license and support kin. We work with DHS too, even on our training. We don't just have our trainings one day of the week. Our trainings are at multiple locations at multiple times of day, and if the kinship caregiver can't get to us, we actually work on getting the caseworker into the house to provide the training. So I hope that answers that question.
Another interesting question, is Pittsburgh more urban, and can this model be replicated in a rural setting?
Well, both of our cities are definitely urban, but Pittsburgh is in Allegheny County, and Philadelphia actually is a county as well. So it's not just rural kinship care that we're, not just inner city that we're working with. We're also working with kinship families that are in the suburbs and with kinship families that are actually out in the rural areas such as Chester County and everything. So we're working not just with one type of setting. I would say that basically the model works is because we don't say that we're an urban model or a rural model. We don't believe in that philosophy. We believe in the value of family and the strength of kinship care. And since you're responding, and if you think about Brace says, we're not making decisions for the family's making decisions for themselves. We're kind of just there to help and assist. So you can't have a model that's urban-based and rural-based because you're going to be able to meet the needs of the family. What happens if that family that's in the city moves to the suburbs, or the family from the suburbs moves back into the city? So we can have a location-based model. It's more of it's a family-based model that's addressing and responding to family.
These questions are really coming through. Talk to us about, this question came in asking, how have you been able to obtain the data, the outcomes?
Okay, we're very big on outcomes. So we have a practice model, and we have a theory practice model, so we specifically call out data. So the caseworkers know when they're doing a home visit, when they're doing a safety assessment, they know what data we're going to be collecting up front. And every time we're doing something new in regards to programming or in regards to case management, the question always circles back to how are we going to measure this so that we can improve it in practice or policy. So it's like when Brace was talking about that reflective questioning, we also do the reflective questioning, the reflective decision making in regards to policy and practice. So I'd say that whenever we're starting something new or working with families, or families approach us with something, our response is, one of our questions to reflect on is, how will this be measured? And how can we measure it, and what needs to be measured specifically? And I think, Lisa, that's probably it, because we have to get one more slide. So we want to thank everybody again, and there will be a recording of this this webinar. It's going to be on our website, but we'll also send you a link to it, and you're going to receive a follow-up email. And once again, it'll have our contact information if you have any questions. Our next webinar, which will be announced soon, is we're going to be talking about the effective tool belt in kinship care and what exactly that tool belt is and who's wearing it. So look for an email about that. And once again, on behalf of everyone here at Second Chance, we want to thank you for joining us for this webinar, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.